Before there was Little Caesars Arena, before there was Joe Louis Arena, there was a building on Grand River Avenue where the noise didn't just fill the air. It shook the rafters. Olympia Stadium, opened in 1927, closed in 1979, demolished in 1987. But if you grew up in Detroit, if you ever walked those concrete steps, you know something important. It never really left. Because Olympia wasn't just a rink. It was where Detroit learned what dominance felt like. It was where fathers took sons. Where mothers explained icing rules. Where radios carried the roar into neighborhoods miles away. It was where the Red Wings became more than a team. They became part of who this city was. And tonight, we're not just remembering a building. We're stepping back into the era when Hockeytown was forged in steel and ice. This is Streets of History. To understand Olympia Stadium, you have to understand Detroit in the 1920s. This was not a cautious city. This was the fastest growing industrial center in America. Henry Ford was changing manufacturing. General Motors was expanding. Chrysler had just been founded in 1925. Detroit wasn't just booming, it was leading, and professional sports were beginning to reflect that same ambition. The NHL had formed in 1917. By the mid-1920s, it was expanding into major American markets. Chicago, Boston, New York. Detroit was too big to ignore. In 1926, Detroit was awarded an NHL franchise. The team was called the Detroit Cougars. But there was a problem. The city didn't yet have a proper arena. So the Cougars played their first season across the river at Border Cities Arena in Windsor. That wasn't sustainable if Detroit was going to be taken seriously in professional hockey. It needed a home. Enter James E. Norris Sr. Norris was a grain merchant from Chicago with deep financial backing and ambition. He believed in professional hockey in the United States. And more importantly, he believed Detroit deserved a first-class facility. Construction began in 1926 at Grand River and McGraw. The site was west of downtown. Industrial, accessible, practical. Olympia was built fast, just under a year. It opened on October 15, 1927. The cost was roughly $2.5 million, a major investment at that time. Seating capacity was around 15,000 for hockey, making it one of the largest arenas in North America. Architecturally, it was industrial. Steel frame, large truss systems spanning the rink, minimal exterior ornamentation. Inside, it felt massive, raw, concrete and steel. This wasn't the elegance of Madison Square Garden. It wasn't the ornate detail of older East Coast arenas. Olympia felt like Detroit. Strong, functional, built for purpose. And it wasn't just for hockey. Olympia hosted boxing matches, wrestling cards, the Shrine Circus, political rallies, ice shows, concerts. During World War II, it hosted bond rallies and large civic gatherings. If something major happened in Detroit between 1927 and 1979, there's a good chance Olympia was involved. But hockey gave it soul. Because the Detroit Cougars struggled early. They finished last their first season. Ownership reorganized. The team briefly became the Detroit Falcons. And in 1932, under new ownership, led by James Norris, the team was renamed the Detroit Red Wings. That moment changed everything, because the winged wheel tied hockey directly to the city's identity. It wasn't borrowed symbolism. It was Detroit. And once the Red Wings found stability under Norris and coach Jack Adams, Olympia Stadium became something else entirely. It became feared. When James E. Norris took control of the franchise in 1932 and renamed the team the Detroit Red Wings, He made one of the most important decisions in franchise history. He hired Jack Adams. Adams wasn't just a coach. He was the architect of early Red Wings identity. He served as coach and general manager, and eventually as a league executive for decades. Hard-nosed, demanding, strategic. He believed in discipline, structure, and depth. And under his leadership, Detroit stopped being an expansion experiment and became a contender. The early 1930s were transitional. The roster began to stabilize. Players like Herbie Lewis, Ebby Goodfellow, and Larry Ari gave the team structure. But the real breakthrough came mid-decade. In 1936, the Red Wings won their first Stanley Cup. The roster featured Marty Berry, a clutch scorer, Mud B, remembered for scoring the longest game-winning goal in NHL history in a 6-overtime playoff game in 1936, Normie Smith, steady in goal, Sid Howe, one of the early offensive anchors, and Jack Adams at the helm. The championship run wasn't flashy, it was disciplined. And Olympia Stadium became something new that spring. It became a place where Detroit celebrated at the highest level. The Red Wings followed it up with another Stanley Cup in 1937. Back-to-back champions at Olympia. Let that sit in for a moment. In just 10 years of existence, that building had already hosted 2 championships. But here's something often overlooked. The 1930s were the middle of the Great Depression. Detroit was hit hard. Unemployment was high. Auto production was unstable. And yet, inside Olympia, 15,000 people packed in to watch hockey. Because sport provided something different. Hope, distraction, pride. Olympia wasn't just entertainment. It was civic morale. And through the late 1930s and into the early 1940s, Detroit remained competitive. But World War II changed everything. Players enlisted, rosters shifted, travel became complicated, yet the Red Wings stayed relevant. And when the NHL consolidated into what became known as the original Six era in 1942, Detroit was positioned perfectly, because Olympia was no longer new. It was established. It was intimidating. It was loud, and the next era would bring names that defined Detroit for generations. Gordie Howe, Ted Lindsay, Sid Abel, Terry Sawchuk. But before we get there, understand this. Jack Adams didn't just win games. He built a culture. Demanding, blue collar, resilient. The same traits Detroit valued in itself. And that culture would carry through the 1940s and explode in the 1950s. In 1942, the NHL shrank. War pressures, financial strain, and instability reduced the league to 6 teams. Detroit, Toronto, Montreal, Boston, Chicago, and New York. This became known as the original Six era. And for the next 25 years, those 6 teams would define professional hockey. For Detroit, it was the beginning of something special. The Red Wings were no longer just competitive. They were becoming dominant. In 1943, Detroit won another Stanley Cup. Players like Adam Brown, Sid Howe, and goalie Johnny Mowers helped secure the championship. But the real turning point came in the late 1940s, because that's when a farm kid from Saskatchewan arrived, Gordie Howe. Howe joined the Red Wings in 1946. He He wasn't flashy at first. He was quiet, strong, relentless. He could score. He could pass. And if necessary, he could fight. By the early 1950s, Gordie Howe wasn't just a player. He was the best all-around player in the world. Multiple Art Ross trophies for scoring, multiple Hart trophies as league MVP. His line with Sid Abel and Ted Lindsay became known as the production line. That name alone tells you everything. This was Detroit hockey. Efficient, relentless, productive. Ted Lindsay wasn't just skilled. He was fierce. He fought for player rights. He helped form what would eventually become the NHL Players Association. He was emotional, explosive, and beloved in Detroit. Sid Abel anchored the line with intelligence and calm control. Behind them stood Terry Sawchuk. Sawchuk was Detroit-born, one of the greatest goaltenders in NHL history. He won the Calder Trophy as Rookie of the Year. He won multiple Vezina trophies as top goalie. He recorded shutout after shutout in Olympia, and he did it while battling injuries, pressure, and enormous expectations. The 1950s were Detroit's dynasty years. Stanley Cups in 1950, 1952, 1954, 1955. 4 championships in 6 seasons. Let that sink in. Olympia wasn't just hosting great teams, it was hosting one of the greatest dynasties in NHL history. When fans packed into that building during those years, they expected to win. The atmosphere? Loud. Confident. Opposing players dreaded coming to Detroit. The ice felt smaller. The noise felt heavier. The boards rattled. If you were there in the 1950s, you weren't watching a game. You were watching excellence. And those years built something permanent, because this is when the phrase Hockey Town started to make sense, even before it became official branding decades later. It wasn't marketing, it was earned. But dynasties don't last forever. And as the 1960s approached, age, expansion, and change began reshaping the league. Yet Olympia endured, still standing, still packed, still the heartbeat of Detroit hockey. The 1950s made Detroit royalty, but the 1960s reminded Detroit that nothing in sports or in cities lasts forever. By the early 1960s, the core of the dynasty was aging. Sid Abel had transitioned into coaching. Ted Lindsay had been traded in 1957, after clashing with ownership over player rights. Terry Sawchuk moved on, returned, moved again. The position of goaltender became unstable. Gordie Howe was still there, still producing, still intimidating, but even legends cannot carry eras alone. The Red Wings remained competitive in the early 1960s. Players like Alex Delvecchio, consistent, smart, respected. Norm Ullman, a smooth, reliable scorer. Bruce McGregor, Marcel Pronquist. These weren't weak teams. They just weren't dynasties anymore. And then 1967 happened. The NHL doubled in size, from 6 teams to 12. Expansion changed everything. More competition, more travel, more markets. The intimate, brutal familiarity of the original 6 era was gone, and Detroit struggled to adapt. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the Red Wings entered what many fans now call the Dead Wings era. Losing seasons, ownership instability, front office mistakes, coaching turnover. The team still had moments, still had talent, but consistency disappeared, and Olympia felt different. It was still loud, still gritty, still packed on big nights, but expectations had shifted. The certainty of the 1950s was gone. Now there was longing, frustration, hope mixed with realism. If you were there during those years, you remember it differently than the dynasty years. You remember cheap seats. You remember fights in the stands. You remember smoking sections. You remember walking those concrete ramps. You remember the smell of beer and popcorn mixing with cold air. You remember loving the team even when they weren't winning, because by then, it wasn't about championships. It was about identity. Olympia wasn't glamorous. It wasn't modern. It wasn't comfortable, but it was ours. And as the 1970s progressed, something else became clear. The building itself was aging. The roof leaked. The infrastructure was dated. Luxury boxes didn't exist. Revenue models were changing in professional sports, and Detroit was facing economic strain as manufacturing began to shift. The Red Wings weren't just battling on the ice. The city was battling in real life. And Olympia Stadium, once a symbol of 1920s ambition, was now nearly 50 years old. The question began quietly. Could this building survive the modern era? By the late 1970s, Olympia Stadium was showing its age. 50 years is a long time for a professional sports arena. The concrete was tired. The sightlines were outdated. There were no luxury suites, no modern revenue streams. Professional sports were changing, and Olympia had. Detroit's new arena had already opened. Joe Louis Arena debuted in December of 1979 along the Detroit River. It was larger, more modern, built with contemporary amenities. It represented the future, but for many fans, it didn't feel like home. The Red Wings played their final game at Olympia on December 15, 1979. They lost 4-3 to the Quebec Nordiques. The outcome almost didn't matter. What mattered was that it was over. After 52 years, after 4 Stanley Cups in the 1950s, after Gordie Howe, after Ted Lindsay, after Sawchuk, after decades of Saturday nights, the doors closed. There was no grand farewell parade, no dramatic send-off tour, just a building that had served its purpose and was no longer needed. That's how it often happens. Places that shape a city don't always get ceremony. They just reach their final night. Olympia sat empty for years. Then in 1987, it was demolished. No preservation fight. No restoration campaign. It was gone. The site at Grand River and McGraw became a grocery store. First to Farmer Jack, later other retailers. If you drive past today, you wouldn't know what stood there, unless you remember. And that's the thing about Olympia. Physically it's gone, but emotionally, it never left. Because Olympia wasn't just a stadium. It was where fathers took sons, where sons became fathers, where radio calls echoed through living rooms, where Detroit proved it could dominate something on a national stage. Before Little Caesars Arena, before Joe Louis Arena, before Hockeytown became official branding, there was Olympia. Raw, loud, imperfect, ours. And here's what matters most. If you were there, you don't remember the architecture. You remember the feeling, the cold walk in, the noise when the puck dropped, the red seats, the smoke hanging in the air, the way it felt when the Wings scored. That's what survives demolition. Memory. Olympia Stadium is gone, but Hockeytown didn't end there. When the Red Wings moved to Joe Louis Arena in 1979, they carried Olympia with them. The grit, the expectation, the identity. Joe Louis Arena would eventually host its own era of greatness. Steve Yzerman, Nicholas Lidstrom, Sergei Fedorov, Darren McCarty, Scotty Bowman behind the bench. Stanley Cups in 1997, 1998, 2002, 2008, and when the Wings moved again to Little Caesars Arena in 2017, that legacy moved with them too. The buildings change. The ice stays. And what started in 1927 at Grand River and McGraw still echoes every time the crowd chants, Olympia built that expectation. Olympia built that standard. Olympia built the idea that Detroit hockey isn't casual. It's identity. It's inheritance. It's memory passed down. And that's why this story matters. Not because of the square footage. Not because of the seating capacity. Not even because of the championships. But because for 52 years, Olympia Stadium held the emotional center of Detroit hockey. And if you were there, we want to hear it. Tell us in the comments. Do you remember your first game at Olympia? Who took you? What do you remember most? The noise? The smell? The fights? The wins? Were you there during the Gordie Howe years? The dynasty? The lean years? Your memory is part of this story. And if you haven't watched our 100 Years of Hockeytown episode yet, go back and start there. This video builds on that one. And next week, we continue Season 3 of Streets of History with an event that shaped this city in a completely different way. The year was 1967, because this series isn't about just buildings. It's about what we keep. This is Streets of History, and in Detroit, we don't just remember places. We remember how they felt.